The disgrace follows the deception of David's son, part 2. There are some things that happen in our lives that just cling to us the whole time. You can think of something as simple as a childhood injury, where there's a scar that is with you your whole life. Thankfully, by the grace of God, scars usually fade over time. However, emotional scars sit there as well. They're with us. But as we'll continue on in this idea, that we'll see that if we understand God's part in our story, we understand what God is doing, then we can see the good he is trying to accomplish in even those scars, even those difficulties. I'll tell you the story of a gal named Jill. Jill sadly grew up with an abusive stepfather and a mother who gave her up at 15, sent her to live in a state home because she blamed Jill for all the abuse she received from her husband. And what got even crazier is years later, she was witnessed to, she became a Christian, and she ended up in the same church as her mother and biological father, all three of them in the same church together. And it didn't really go very well because, again, she lived under an abusive stepfather, and so every day, every Sunday in particular, she would live and die based on how many compliments her father gave her, because she had this deep scar of missing her father, and the only way to soothe the scar was compliments from her father. What he said about her determined whether she had a good day or a bad day, and you can imagine that left her pretty depressed in the end, because no one can say enough good things about you. That's a horrible burden. She tried a number of things. It wouldn't work until she finally went to her church's counselors and asked for help. And they began to work through her to give her a new hope. Not just a hope in her father, but a hope in the Lord. That this idea of Jesus rising from the dead. They began to kind of work through this idea with her and explain to her, what would you say if I told you Jesus didn't rise from the dead? They're like, well, no, that'd be very upsetting. Like, that's everything to me. And she realized that as she said she could not change, she was actually refusing to honor Christ. She was refusing to recognize the same power that raised Jesus from the dead could change her. And they began to walk through this process. This is a very good little book by Steve Byers called Putting Your Past in Its Place. And this truth that she began to form and understand what God had done with her past. Christ being the solution to her past. Christ's approval being the one that she needed, not that of even her biological father. We'll come back to her story a little bit later. But this whole chapter, not the whole chapter, but the first part of the chapter, verses 1 through 22, has 7 character moments that bring us to despair that only Jesus can heal. And we talked about all these different characters, these meetings between different characters, that really just takes you in this downward spiral to see how dark things are. And it started off, verses 1 and 2, with the characters being introduced. Now, before I get there, the timeline is a little interesting, because here we see the adultery of Bathsheba happened in 992 BC. Solomon was born in 991. This is happening 987. A few years later, there's a little chart up there, it's in the middle of David's reign. So Solomon is this little boy. It's been a few years out, but it's also been long enough for people to really hear the story of what David had done. This is spread probably far and wide, I suggest. So, like I said, the story started off with the introduction of our characters. The first one being Absalom. And we talked about who is the very first name mentioned in chapter 13? Absalom. Why is he mentioned first? Did anyone remember? Remember, at the end of chapter 12, we saw that David was going to experience consequences for his sin, and that someone would bring violence in his family. Who brings the violence in his family? Absalom, right? So he's actually the main part. The story is setting up this judgment that is going to take place. But Absalom has a lovely sister named Tamar. We talked about this beautiful woman named after David's ancestor. She's known for her beauty, loved, a godly woman in all respects. And then there was David's son, Amnon. Amnon was his oldest son by David's wife Ahinoam, who bore him in Hebron before he was king of both Jerusalem, being just Judah at that time, not Israel as well. And Amnon looks at his sister and he falls in love with her. She's so pretty, beautiful eyes, luscious looks, and he obsesses over her. But we said it's not love, right? It was lust. Because, again, look at verse 2, end of verse 2. It says, it seemed impossible to Amnon to do anything to her. What's his focus? Is his focus on being with her? No, it's doing something to her. Right? Like this is obsession. This is lust. So he gets really upset, and then we saw that he and his friend Jonadab make a plan. They concoct this great lie where this crafty cousin, Jonadab, gives Amnon the horrible idea of lying to his father and tricking his sister into coming alone with him, because at that time the young maidens were kept separate from the men. They wouldn't have been timed. She would have been protected, having courtiers by her at all time. There's no way to really get alone with her. So he figures out a way to trick David into allowing her to be alone, saying, pretend to be sick and tell your father you want your sister to come to you. And he does just that, saying, I want my sister to bring me bread. Only her. Only she'll do. And so she comes, and David sends her. And we receive then this vile moment with Tamar. Let's read it just again to get the story, verses 9 through 14. And she took the pan, and she emptied it out before him, but he refused to eat. And Amnon said, send out everyone from me. So everyone went out from him. Then Amnon said to Tamar, bring the food into the chamber, that I may eat from your hands. And Tamar took the cakes she had made and brought them into the chamber to Amnon, her brother. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said, come, lie with me, my sister. She answered him, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where could I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be as one of the outrageous fools in Israel. Now therefore, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lay with her. Again, this horrible event happens where he tricks her into coming over. Hold a second. Yay, technology. There we go. So he tricks her into coming over. She says no, no, and he overpowers her. With his brute strength, being a man, she is a woman, and forces herself into his bed. Tragic moment. Evil. But what is Amnon's response after he gets what he wanted? He has been obsessing over her for months. He finally gets to be with her, and how does he respond? We'll see. The fifth event that happens is hatred. Amnon's love turns to hatred. Verses 15 through 17. The king's servant said to my page changed there. Sorry. Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred. So the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which she had loved her. And Amnon said to her, "Get up, go." But she said to him, "No, my brother, for this is wrong, and sending me away is greater than the other that you did to me." But he would not listen to her. He called the young man who served him and said, "Put this woman out of my presence," and bolt the door after him. Now, this is actually, if you break up the whole story into words, this is the very center of the story. This is the downward part of the story. This is the climax, or just the deepest pit of it. And interestingly, though he has defiled Tamar by rape, this object that was his precious fantasy, reality has set in now. His love has turned to hatred. And if you translate the verse literally, word for word, you get this interesting grammatical structure where it says, "Then Ammon hated her with a hatred great, exceedingly. Indeed, great was the hatred with which he hated her." How much did he hate her? He hated her a lot. This newfound intensity is there. And it's actually very common for rapists, especially those who are involved in things of date rape, where they realize that, in fact, everything that they did will not satisfy because they will not be loved back. God designed sex and sexual intimacy to be a mutual giving of two people. One of the clearest passages that speak about this is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. It says, the husband is to give his conjugal, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourself to prayer, and then come together again, so Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. 1 Corinthians 7, 3 through 5. So it's this idea, it makes all sense. Each person within a marriage has conjugal rights. And rape is taking. Marriage and intimacy, as God designed it, is supposed to be about both parties giving to each other. Not about taking and saying, give me my rights. It's about each person is supposed to give to the other. Assault by nature is taking. And because it is taking, it disappoints. It doesn't produce love. So, he commands her then. Just like he was trying, I tried to make a suggestion that perhaps he was trying in his own wickedness, woo her by using the term sister, not as like actual sister, but as a sweet, enduring sweetie kind of way. Like he was trying to convince her, please come to bed with me. Now he's saying, get up and get out. Does he sound pleased? No. Like here he is commanding her, get away from him. What's hard about this too, in the Torah, any man who slept with a virgin, he was required to either marry her or pay a financial penalty to her father for the care of her. It's in Exodus 22, 16 through 17, or Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29 says, if a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to her father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife, because he has violated her. He may not divorce her all his days. And I think that sounds a little weird to our modern ears. And Deuteronomy 22, 28 to 29 is basically saying, if a man comes along, he rapes a woman, they have to get married. And that's not what we would encourage today. It's not to say that should happen today, but it was a defense for women because she now begs him to not send her away because that would be worse. Having been defiled, no longer being a virgin, in Israelite culture, there's almost no chance that she would be able to be married. Her only place in Israelite society was to be the wife of the man who had taken her. Ancient world was very hard on women. You know, she would rather be married to a monster like Amnon than be cast off. Like, that's how sad this was. Again, it just does not condone the relationship between a woman and her rapist. This is not saying this should happen. It's just describing the horrible situation that existed. And the law was designed to discourage men from doing that, saying, you can't just get away with it. But in verse 17, instead, he calls his young man. Now, it's not just a young man, right? It's his young man or his special servant who he's calls him. And interestingly, when you look at it in our ESV translations, he says, put this woman out of my presence and bolt the door after her. But in the Hebrew, it's literally, put this away. He literally says, put this out of my presence. This woman he has lusted after is now not even a woman anymore. She's just a thing to him. Worthless trash. And he won't even do it himself. He sends his servant to get rid of her. This teaches the lesson: sin does not satisfy. As much as I think we want to put ourselves in the picture place of David fighting Goliath at times, or maybe we're, you know, some of us might feel like we're Tamar being victimized. Let's be honest, at times, Christians are tempted to be Amnon. Well, whether it's the lies of drugs, which say, oh yes, take this drug and you will feel so much better. All your pains will go away. And yet you know, of course, what happens is your body builds up immunity to it, and you need more and more and more to get the same feeling. What was a tool to make you feel better now controls you. You get over one problem and another comes up. Sin does not satisfy. Amnon did not find satisfaction in committing this wicked act. And we, brothers and sisters, must beware that we do not go and commit a wicked act either. We have to start fighting sin early, whether it's anger or greed or lust or idolatry, envy, whatever it may be. Those sins start small, but they become big and overpowering, and they defeat us. They destroy us and leave us on the side of the road, naked and ashamed. And one key to fighting, helping us remember that what sin is offering is a lie, is brothers and sisters around us as fellow soldiers in the fight. So not only do we remember that sin does not satisfy, we need to have fellow soldiers. If Amnon had just a good friend instead, someone who would come alongside him and do as Hebrews 3:13 said, exhort one another as long as it is called today, that you may not be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Saying, hey, brother, sister, this isn't what you want. This will not satisfy you. This relationship isn't good. This thing you are pursuing, you don't want this. Let's pray, and by God's grace, it will not look as tantalizing anymore. We'll see more of that next time as we have to deal with what happens afterwards. But Tamar leaves the room. She goes to her brother, And we see the next character moment, verses 18 through 20. Tamar and Absalom respond to her disgrace. Now, she was wearing a long robe with sleeves. For thus were the virgin daughters of the king dressed. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. And Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the long robe that she wore. And she laid her hand on her head and went away, crying aloud as she went. And her brother Absalom said to her, "Has Amnon your brother been with you? Now hold your peace, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." Verse 18 gives us a description of her clothing, and leading us to verse 19 to what happens with it. Right? So she's actually wearing a long coat. Now, this is the same word actually of Joseph's coat of many colors, and it's translated coat of many colors in Genesis 37 by many people, but sometimes it's the same word here, coat with long sleeves. And young ladies would wear undergarments, just like men would, underneath their clothing, but then they would wrap themselves in fancy dresses. Everyone kind of wore long clothes, as you can see at that time, because they needed fabric. They couldn't make slim materials, and they would bring it up. So they'd have long garments, and these young virgins, it seemed, would have especially long flowing arms as a symbol of their virginity, probably defining that they were not working, because could you imagine being a mother having long sleeves and trying to take care of babies? I think that was probably the point, maybe. Like they weren't taking care of babies yet. Unclear. The text doesn't say why. But here they have long, noticeable sleeves. Must have been beautiful to look at. And she's wearing it, again, as she is thrown out of the room. Whatever happens, servant takes her, obeys his master, kicks her out, and she responds in utter despair. There's some ancient Egyptian drawings like this one of women pouring ashes on top of her head. Just a symbol of sadness, of depression. She took her fancy clothes, which represented her virginity, and she tears them, a symbol of inward anguish, mourning, like the mourning of a widow whose husband has died. And then Absalom shows up, back to the story. This man who would be king eventually, her weeping and her ripped virgin garments, plus the fact that he probably knows that she was just sent to Amnon's room to take care of him and comes screaming out. He figures things out pretty quickly, doesn't he? It's a nice way of saying, he's like, have you been with? It's a very nice way of describing the ugly truth of what has just happened. And no response is recorded from what she says, right? Her voice is now silent for the rest of history. But the results will be, her actions will speak. But he returns and responds then to her saying, "Don't set your heart on this, sister. This is a family matter. He's your brother. It will be handled as a family matter. You don't worry about it." But look at verse 22. Who worries about it for the next years? Absalom, right? He's going to worry about it for her. Now, Tamar instead lives as a desolate woman in her brother's house for the rest of her days. Robert Bergen, in his commentary on this, writes, Absalom attempted to provide her with some comfort and consolation. He could neither give Tamar a husband nor be one to her, but he provided her with two of the amenities associated with marriage, a place to live and the attendant promise of protection. But she is desolate. Another word for that is devastated, or destitute, or trash laid on a heap. Like, it's so interesting. I don't know if you've ever been. There's a big dump right over the hills here, right? The Irvine dump. If you go out there, when you're dropping stuff off, you sometimes see things scattered around, like precious old toys. I have little kids right now. My girls love their dollies. They cherish them, they carry them, and there's nothing like seeing a kid's toy dolly sitting desolate in a trash heap. That is Tamnar's position. She would never know marriage. She would never know motherhood. And this was a big deal for an Israelite. This isn't just not having children. This is you do not get to participate in the blessing of bringing about the Messiah. Remember we said all of Israel, they're all looking for who is the promised seed. She does not get any chance of bringing about the promised seed from Eve. Victims, when they face these kind of situations, need tender love and care because they feel desolate. Meredith was a young woman who had been a victim of sexual abuse, and she used to take a large and rough sponge and scrub herself with a scoring pad normally used to clean dirty pots. So you know those ones that are used in your kitchen sink to scrub it? She would take that to try and scrub the dirt off herself, to try and remove the stain from her soul. Some friends met with her. They talked with her. They wept with her. They took her to the Psalms of Lament and showed her God's cry over sad and evil in this world. And ultimately, they took her to the cross. And one day, she brought a cloth because she no longer needed that sponge anymore. It was a beautiful sign where she finally was like, I understand Jesus has cleansed me. See, Tamar was a righteous woman from all accounts. There's nothing to indicate any kind of unrighteousness in her life. She honored her father, she willingly served her brother, and she tried to say no to wickedness. And so her story teaches us the sad theological lesson that terrible things may happen to the righteous person in this life. Terrible things sometimes happen to righteous people in this life. As 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12 through 13 says, do not be surprised, brothers, at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though some strange thing were happening to you. Don't be surprised when bad things happen to good people, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. See, God doesn't promise ease. He doesn't promise no suffering. He promises something greater. He promises beauty for ashes. There's this famous passage in Isaiah 54 talking about the promise of Jesus coming, how you would have ashes and something would grow from it. Isaiah 54 says, sing, O barren one. Break forth into singing, you who have never been in labor, like Tamar, who's cast off. He says, for the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married. Enlarge the place of your tent. Let your curtains of your habitations be stretched out. And that the children of the desolate woman will surpass the children of the married woman. The desolate woman is to fall on her knees and beseech God, who is the source of all supply, casting herself on God's mercy. And God promises fruitfulness, which we'll see being in spiritual children. You think of it this way. Tamar is not able to have any children, right? No biological children. She is never able to get married. But how many people have read her story over the centuries and felt a kinship, a motherhood, a likeness to this woman because they have been in the same situation as her? Later in Isaiah 54, verse 5, it says, God says, your maker is your husband. The Lord Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. God redeems from evil and does good. This doesn't minimize the horrible things that have happened. This doesn't say they weren't actually bad. But slowly but surely, with the help of brothers and sisters in Christ, we're able to walk towards seeing the blessings of God's glory shine through. And this blessing could have happened in Israel. It could have been there. We could read about that in the next section. But we don't. Because instead we'll see David is frozen by sin. But Absalom conspires. It would be such a great story to see God's redemption come through here. And that might make us think, oh, the story always ends well. Like, look at the good that comes from it. But we learn from this example here, sometimes the story doesn't end happy this side of heaven. Verses 21 and 22, David the king heard of these things, and he was very angry. But Absalom spoke to Amnon neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. Pastor Tim Chester, writing on this verse, says, the surprise you get to in reading verse 21 is not actually what it says, but what it doesn't say. David's fury is entirely justified, right? Like there are some things to be righteously angry about, and this is one of them. I think we can agree on that. But the surprise is nothing happens next. Nothing is done. In the Septuagint translation of this passage, it actually adds a phrase that says, David would not punish him because he loved him and he was his firstborn. There's some good reasons why that's not in the text. It's not found in the oldest Hebrew. So possibly, there's a possibility it's because it's his firstborn who he loves and he cares for. But a lot of commentators will say that's not in the text. But you know what is in the text? Is chapter 11 and 12 right beforehand, right? They say David is compromised. He himself was exposed as an adulterer and a murderer. So what can he do? Right? Well, what can he say? Because he was just as bad, in fact, worse than his son. So how can he say anything? And you could imagine David's guilt paralyzes him. He comes across as an overindulgent father and commits the same sin as Eli. Remember Eli, way back when in 1 Samuel we started this? Eli had two sons who were abusing women as well. And they were priests, and women would come serve in the temple, and they would be abused. And then they would also take the best food from the people, not offer it to God, but instead eat it themselves. And he comes to them in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel, chapter 2, verse 23, and says, why are you doing this? For I have heard your evil dealings, my son. Because if someone sins against God, or if someone sins against man, God will mediate for him. But if someone sins against Yahweh, who can intercede for him? But they did not listen to the voice of their father. They're like, wow, at least he warned them, right? But he doesn't do anything to stop them. And in the next chapter, God comes and rebukes him, saying, you will be judged because I gave this to you, and you have honored your sons above me by fattening yourselves on the choice parts of every offering of my people Israel. See, Eli didn't act against his sons because he liked what he was getting from them, the choicest meat. David doesn't act against his son because his sin makes him feel guilty and he stops. Which is so crazy. Because if you can't, hold your finger here and go to Psalm 51 with me. Remember, we looked at this in chapter 12. Psalm 51 is David's statement of confession and asking for God's cleansing after he sinned with Bathsheba. And in verse 12, he makes this great plea that we're aware of. Restore to me the joy of your salvation and uphold me with a willing spirit. Verse 13, then I will teach transgressors your ways and sinners will return to you. So what does he pray that he'll be able to do? Teach who? Transgressors. Who just transgressed in sexual sin like David did? Amnon. And does David do anything to teach him about the justice and the grace of God? No. When his son sinned, he does nothing. David had this chance. He might have been able to stop the loss of further life and brought grace to light in the situation. God's changing of it. Instead, he remains silent, which gives approval of sin. And this is a great reminder for us. We sin. We're sinners. You and I are sinners. We mess up. And that sin is to not just stay silent, but sometimes be brought out as a warning to someone else. Or as a, hey, you've sinned in the same way I have. I've been forgiven. You could be forgiven too. Things get worse in verse 22, though. As Absalom hates his brother, but says nothing. You can almost imagine, again, put on your imagination hats and picture David going, well, that was really bad, but everyone seems like they're okay. Like, here Tamar is with her brother, Amnon is silent, Absalom isn't saying anything, like, no one's fighting, okay, it's fine. But this whole time, Amnon spends 2 years planning this great feast, which we'll read about next, and how he is going to murder his brother for all the hatred growing more and more. See, silence does not mean peace and forgiveness. We talk often about the famous day in Christmas 1914, right? That it was silent on the Western Front because Pope Benedict suggested a temporary hiatus for World War I so that they could celebrate Christmas Day. Sounds great. And interestingly, the warring countries refused. They're like, no, Germany and France and England are like, no way, we're not giving a truce. But the soldiers came out of their trenches on Christmas Day and celebrated. And there was a day of peace and no one was fighting. But guess what they started doing the next day again? Killing each other. There was no peace. True peace requires more than silence. True peace requires the grace of God to work through the hard issues. Amy Baker, who is a biblical counselor and working with ladies like Jill that we talked about at the beginning, she applies this truth to victims today, saying that those who have been abused need a protector. They need power, and God can provide both. And there's this important truth. They have to learn that no human being can provide the power for them. They can't get the power themselves. They can't get it from someone else. Wayne Mack, another counselor writing on this, says, it's good to see how powerless we are at times. Because by recognizing how small we are, we recognize how we need his presence, his strength, and his support. So she says that Amy's talking about this, and she says, we take them again, like we talked about, to a number of the lament psalms. Remind them of the sadness. Like we talked about a couple weeks ago, how Jesus takes away the disgrace. Take them to the cross. Remind them that Jesus died to cleanse them from not just their own sins, but the disgrace done against them. But then comes faith in action. Take that power and use it. Use that power, she says. Use that power to welcome them to endure even through the unbearable. When it seems like they can't get up today, say, because of Christ, you can. Keep going. Use that power to grow in the knowledge and trust of God. Psalm 9 verse 10 says, those who trust God's name will trust in him. Those who know God's name, who know more about him, will begin to trust him. Psalm 9 verse 10. And then use that power to do good and love others. Like David, Psalm 51, use it to teach transgressors his way. Even the offender. Loving the offender. And she's very wise about this. I totally encourage you to look up, especially as you want to point you to some resources. You know someone who has dealt with an abusive person, how to wisely love the enemy, the offender. And she says, make it a place where there's safety, especially for the one who is the source of the victim. Like, it's not like, hey, go back in the room by yourselves and work it out. Like, no way, ever. But the victimizer, the abuser, needs the gospel as well. Needs to hear about Jesus dying for his sins. And he needs people to bring and disciple him. And most importantly, he needs to repent, to turn from his sin. And love gives that opportunity. Again, I want to suggest how different this story would have been if David had done this. If he had used grace and restored his children to God, showing them of the wickedness of their sin and the need for repentance. These stories show us how bad unchecked sin gets. But it's also a reminder that Christ can work in the most horrible situations. We could all be a David, or a Tamar, or an Amnon, sinning or being sinned against, and yet God does not leave us there. But the cross takes our disgrace and it forgives our sin.